So again, just start with a introduction to the concept here in part one. So we've got a few slides that speak to what is a complete street. I think we all have an idea of what that might mean. Um, and I think it's important that we're all kind of using the same general definition. We've got a shared understanding of what we mean when we're generally referring to, all of us in the room referring to complete streets, right? So um, according to the AMATS Complete Streets policy, it is this: complete streets means streets that are designed, used, and operated to enable safe, equitable access for all traffic. So traffic is further defined as persons in wheelchairs, pedestrians, cyclists, people driving, people taking transit, um, and users of all ages and abilities, right? So we're going to see that term in particular, all ages and abilities, play out throughout this presentation. It's about safety, but it's also about comfort. It's about user experience, right? And although it's complete streets or complete street in uh, in our common use of the word, generally defined to the streetscape, a corridor, what we're talking about, it applies to an entire network. It applies to a complete network of streets, a system of streets, and we want to continue to stress that as well. So um, we have a complete streets policy. We want to further refine that, define it, and think about what comes next, right? How do we apply some of these concepts in practice? So all ages and abilities, multimodal active transportation, complete networks, complete systems. And then we'll get into some other things that some of you may also be familiar with that are more of a reflection of the evolution of complete streets over the last 5 to 10 years. So things like modal hierarchy, level of traffic stress, level of comfort.
Question.
Sure.
Is this plan going to be building on the complete streets policy or updating it, incorporating it out of that existing policy?
Oh, so this plan is an extension of the policy. So the policy clarifies the direction and some of this policy direction and the goals of complete streets in Anchorage. And this plan is all about implementation, how we implement complete streets, where and how essentially.
Okay, so we talk about complete streets. Why are we doing it, right? So we often talk about the benefits, and we can talk about that in a variety of different ways in terms of cost, and the financial benefits, benefits to the economy. Obvious, of course, is safety and comfort, connectivity, mobility, access, which we can translate into the public health benefits of complete streets, and then of course the environmental benefits, especially when we're incorporating things like landscaping and other types of um, ecological measures like stormwater capture, right? To make it a more complete street. So I'm not going to read through all of this, but these are the ways that we can begin to talk about it, right? This is a part of the way that the storytelling behind why we do this. So complete streets it's a term that's been around for decades now. It's a concept that's been around for decades now, but I think the way that we should be thinking about it should also reflect changes that we see out there in the real world, especially changes that have been more recent over the last 5 years or so. So we're starting to see things like shared micromobility, bike share, scooter share, uh, all of these other kinds of devices, right, that are either operating on sidewalks or in bike lanes, things like that. We want to try to account for that. We want to try to account for this new kind of activity, which brings with it a lot of opportunities and challenges for the ways we think about our streets and how they function. And then, of course, complete networks, right? Thinking about complete streets in the context of a system of complete streets, so that folks have a way to get from point A to point B across town, across the region, without relying on having to take a variety of modes. They can choose a mode and get there from point A to point B. They can do it safely. They can do it comfortably, and they can ideally enjoy that trip. Okay, so when we think about the network, we want to be thinking about not just the streetscape in its entirety, but we want to be thinking about all of the different modes that are going to be using that street or that corridor. And we want to think about the ways that the facilities we build for those modes and the people in those facilities are um, uh, interacting in a way that is going to be safe and is going to be comfortable and encouraging, right? Um, this is also to say that not every complete street's going to look the same. When we talk about a multimodal corridor or a multimodal streetscape, right? It's going to look very different depending on the context, depending on what part of town it is in. And it's going to serve a different mix of modes, right? So not every street's going to need to have a bike lane. I think that's an important point that we all need to be making, right? Not every street's going to have a bus stop. Not every street's going to have a bus line, right? So how can we complete the street in a way that serves the broader system? That's, I think, the $1 million question. How many of you are familiar with a modal hierarchy in concept? Great, yeah. So how many of you are beyond concept? How many of you know of a place that has established a modal hierarchy? Yeah, great. This is a relatively new thing. I would say it's in the last 10 years, more and more agencies, more and more jurisdictions are starting to adopt this, right? Putting people first. It's less about moving cars and more about moving people. And the way to do that safely, efficiently, comfortably is to prioritize the different modes and where we put our investments, where we put our dollars, where we center our programs, right? And so this modal hierarchy is really trying to emphasize that it's our more vulnerable road users, right? It's our people walking, biking, rolling, taking transit that we should be lifting up and putting our investments behind, right? So this is something that you're starting to see in a lot of complete street policies and resolutions. You're starting to see in a lot more plans, and you're starting to see it as a formalized policy. Okay, so just wanted to get a little bit of feedback here. Colin's got some examples, yeah, that I hope you're all familiar with. And we want to, as we go through these, we want you to be thinking about not only is this a complete street, but who is it serving? Is it what we would consider all ages and abilities? Is it not only safe, but comfortable, encouraging, right? So,
Yeah, so definitely keep that all in mind. And this is just to get us thinking about, as Derek was mentioning, some local examples of streets that have complete streets components, maybe were designed to be complete streets, kind of what some of the strengths are, maybe where some of the shortcomings are. I'm gonna go through the list really quickly. So when we get to the discussion component, if anybody wants me to go back to something, I can easily do that. So I have a bit of a short list here, but first, E Street downtown between 3rd and 17th Avenue. Creekside Center Drive, the entire length. 15th Avenue between Orca and Ingra Street. West 10th Avenue between A and P Street. Arctic Boulevard between 17th and Fireweed. O'Malley Road between Seward Highway and Lake Otis Parkway. And then Old Eagle River Road between Meadow Creek Drive and Monte Road. So again, just to open it up, does anybody have kind of thoughts on those streets, where they might be doing things well, where there could be some improvement, where they might be falling short, or any reactions at all to that? Yep. And some things to think about, we have really appropriate and continuous facilities on some of these streets, but are there opportunities to cross where people might need to cross? Are they comfortable with the speed and amount of traffic? Are they adequately maintained in the winter? And is there enough provision for keeping them clear in all seasons? So some things to think about.
feel like
Mhm.
the drivers using 15 are super aware. So it was, I think it was probably designed in theory to function super well. But and then as soon as you go east of Orca, you're either spit off onto a trail that is in terrible condition or a sidewalk that has overgrown. That's a 5-foot sidewalk next to a 40-mile-per-hour street that has overgrown landscaping. So and if that one section functions all right, it's in between some pretty rough areas. So
Yeah.
if you're thinking about the network as a whole, it's definitely.
So crossings and connectivity and just being able to get, it's not very porous, I guess. Peter?
But not few slides we had about having network.
One of my gut reactions, like looking at these photos, kind of stripping myself out of the context, I know these streets. When I see the ones like Creekside Center and 15 that have nice landscaping, as you flash through the photos, like my gut reaction is, oh, that's a complete street, because like it looks more like the pictures you'd see in a complete streets plan. Whether or not it actually functions that way, but that's my gut reaction. Seeing the trees and stuff makes me think that it is.
Yeah, and they do have a lot of positive components. You know, this picture right here, Creekside Center, it has protected median for pedestrians to cross. They have transit facilities. They have, you know, generous. One side has pretty generous sized pathway, and there's even a buffer to separate from traffic. So, you know, there and all these examples are definitely good things. There may be some details, and I think mainly related to the network, just the connectivity and the crossings that really they kind of fall short sometimes.
Controls keep going and fell in front to the point where the sun on the brakes and physically couldn't see it. It was just gone underneath the hood somewhere. Then he popped back up, and it was just an example of the kind of difference between driving on a road that encourages you to go reasonable speed versus if that had happened on O'Malley Road.
Yeah.
Run the kid over before I could ever back to the brake.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Speed, huge component. Most of these, with the exception you mentioned, O'Malley, you know, that's clearly a higher speed road, and maybe that's a good transition to talk about that a little bit. You know, this is where we get into context as well. So, is O'Malley Road a complete street for its context, or could it be improved? You know, thinking about 15th Avenue, the Fairview area, that's the crossings. Them being so difficult is very much probably not so appropriate for the context. But O'Malley Road, you know, there are a few crossings, but it's also in a much different land use context. So is that appropriate or is it not? And winter maintenance, you know, there is a bike lane, bike lane / shoulder. There's an attached side path with no buffer. So in the winter, as we know right now, you know, it gets very, very difficult to traverse. So
I was gonna say, in my perspective, in Anchorage, the street includes snow storage area. If you don't have a snow storage area in Anchorage, you don't have a street. But then a straight bike path like that on the valley, speeds and volumes, it's not the right facility for bike on.
Yep.
Based on the guidance that exists. So separated multi-use path would be a much more appropriate facility versus multi-use path isn't separated.
Yep. And that's a really good point too. You know, just because there's a bike lane doesn't mean it's the right spot for it. And that's another contextual element. You know, it's with that speeds and the volumes, that's most people are not going to want to bike in the street, that location. So
I think it's easy to look at a lot of these examples, photos of these examples, and start to pick them apart, start to think about how
where is the room for improvement? I think we could argue there's room for improvement on all of them, right? But that's one of the beautiful things about this modal hierarchy. It gives us a framework for evaluating roadways based on the user type. So talking about the pedestrian and experience, right? When snow is being stored in a buffer, if there's a buffer, right? And thinking about it from the perspective of different users to help us identify, what are those areas for improvement with each of these streets to make them more complete.
Yep, exactly. And thinking about the age ranges too, of all ages and abilities, in terms of, some crossings might be fine for us as adults, but for a smaller child, they might be kind of a deal breaker. So, any other thoughts before we keep going? Yep.
I don't know, I'm sure some people know the history, I don't know the history of it, but I'm glad you included the Creekside Center Drive example. I think that was done entirely by private development. I think it's important to put in here because that's just not, department or agency folks dreaming that up. That's a representation of what was in code or in standards to require a developer to build that. So.
Yeah.
Well,
And that's why it looks the way it does for that stretch, right? And it functions the way it functions, and then it ends, and then what, right? So, good point. Yeah.
Creekside Center Drive as well. It's a nice, like, lower volume, cars are going a little bit slower. And there's it's, they've been putting higher density housing there. I mean, like, it's like they build it and then it got more dense. So that's been really cool. And there is a way to get there, like if I wanted to walk from my neighborhood, I could get there and get to the Fred Meyer. But it's the wayfinding is horrible. Like it's go down this dead end street to get to the path. I mean, it's just so that talking about that connection to make it a network, it needs a little wayfinding.
Yeah, it's interesting as well. It had a completely different master plan that has not evolved the original master plan vision. So it's kind of like build it and then it down. It has to make some context to it that I think it's supposed to be something else. And hopefully it's not about the way it is for the house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, keep that in mind. I think just some of those different factors and elements of a complete street, what can work, but what might need work depending on context. And switching gears a little bit, going to a policy basis for what we're doing here. So just the quote that we like for, explains complete streets policies and kind of what they're about broadly. I'll just read it. A complete streets policy ensures that the entire right of way is routinely designed and operated to enable safe access for all users. Pedestrians, bicyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities must be able to safely move along and across a complete street. So it's a good quote because it brings a variety of things into the mix. It talks about maintenance, talks about routinely, here that could mean all seasons. It's not just summer, it's not just winter. Talks about different modes and different ages and abilities. And it also brings up the fact that people need to cross the street. It's not enough just to have a street where you can move along. You have to get to destinations on either side. And digging into it a little bit, what does a complete streets policy do? And this is going to be some review for a lot of you because, we have a complete streets policy. AMATS has a policy and it does many of these things, if not most of them. And I won't read through them all, but establishing commitment and vision is really important. Applying to all projects and phases, coordination, adopts excellent design guidance. The policy does reference multiple design guides and the potential to bring those in to complete streets design. Measuring progress, setting criteria for choosing projects. It also interacts with funding projects. So the AMATS tip is influenced by the complete streets, whether a street is complete or not. And that affects tip scoring, transportation improvement program scoring. And last, I bolded this at the bottom. So a good complete streets policy creates a plan for implementation. And that's, what this effort's all about. It's taking the policy, how do we implement the policy? Question?
DOT has a complete streets plan. Picking, is there any intention to align it with that, or would this be charting its own separate?
So my understanding is DOT is working on a complete streets policy, which we will definitely coordinate with that effort. It's going to be different than this effort since the plan is going to be more implementation focused. But at the same time, we want to make sure, and they're part of the stakeholder group that will be consulting regularly. So we will get their thoughts on both this plan and maybe learn something from their policy that we could incorporate into our efforts.
It's fair to say we're not in any way beholden to what that policy, okay. Perfect.
If I
Yep,
add
yep.
something to Zach's question, so Zach, the statewide policy that DOT is working on right now, it's for it's for the entire state, and areas that don't have, or communities or metros that don't have their own complete streets policy or plan, that policy would apply. But because AMATS and FAST have their own policies, that's what applies to this area.
Right, that's a really good distinction. So the statewide policy may not apply in Anchorage, but we will, because we have our own policy. It's definitely a project team and a effort that we want to coordinate with. So yeah, just to go over a few existing policies and how they interact with Complete Streets Plan. That's one of them. So thanks for bringing that up. I won't go into, we just talked about the AMATS Complete Streets policy, but this plan is an instrument of that policy essentially. One that's definitely important to talk about is the context sensitive solutions process. And CSS, as it's known, is just that. It's a process. And we see or envision this plan being used within the CSS process to implement Complete Streets as a kind of a guiding tool. So, for example, I guess show of hands just to see who's not familiar with the CSS process. Okay, it will explain that a little bit. I'll step back in terms of what is CSS. So, context sensitive solutions is a program or a policy and a process where municipal and state projects are required to go through an actual land use entitlement program through the municipality that vets it for being context sensitive. So that the way that's decided, it goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Urban Design Commission, and they ultimately make the call. But planning staff and municipal employees, and state employees influence that process in terms of, they help determine in this situation, given the plans in place, what is appropriate. Is this facility appropriate? Do we need to make changes to the facility? Is something missing, etc. So it takes existing plans into account, but it's not prescriptive. So it's a process to implement those plans essentially on specific projects. And it's a little bit subjective. We have plans in Anchorage that are very good plans, but sometimes there are multiple layers. There might be an important bike route, important freight route, an important pedestrian route. And how do you balance all those competing priorities? And that's where the CSS policy is helpful in terms of having that conversation, but there's often not enough specificity in terms of this corridor needs this type of design, this one needs this type of design. It can be kind of hit or miss depending on how the process goes. So where this plan fits into that, we want to make this clear because CSS is really important and helpful existing policy, and we don't want to make clear where this plan falls in that kind of hierarchy. But within the overarching CSS process, the Complete Streets plan would be identifying corridors and typologies that, as Derek mentioned before, with the hierarchy of users, would make that clear. Let's say this corridor is priority bike and ped corridor. So bike and ped facilities would be very important to try to accommodate first in the limited right-of-way situation. And there will be other corridors, depending on the context, which maybe have a very large freight component. So freight needs to be accommodated, and then we also need to accommodate other users. So that's the kind of question this plan will help answer for the CSS process, as well as other municipal projects, not just through CSS, but adding some predictability to the process, adding some detail and specificity, and just making it more understandable and kind of, again, predictable. So we already talked about the Alaska statewide complete streets policy a little bit, shift gears onto that. We'll coordinate with that project, but as Juan mentioned, it will not necessarily directly impact Anchorage in terms of a policy. So land use, we talked about context a lot. Anchorage has a really good land use plan. There are a lot of different land use classifications. They vary from rural to mixed use residential, mixed commercial. There's a lot of detail in that plan. And, one of the things actually in that plan, there is land use plan goal or objective to create a complete streets policy. And then, that policy will be implemented by this plan. So that's an important component that's mentioned in the plan itself. Broadly, land use and context is very important to pair the right type of street with the type of land use that it serves. So, and that kind of, I think, came out in our discussion of the different examples in Anchorage where, there's some great streets that were designed quite well, but they might not match up with the land use context. And that's where, this plan is going to get in the weeds a little bit and determine what corridors or what types of facilities are most important for what types of land use. And one of those determining factors will be the land use plan. What is planned in the future? What exists now? What do we want the street to look like? Back to you, Derek.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about design here. And again, we're going to touch on this idea about context, how it relates to context-sensitive solutions, and how we are accounting for context, land use context, transportation context, the streetscape context, from the perspective of different users throughout, especially in this design chapter. So, when we talk about all ages and abilities, we talk about satisfying the needs of all of the different modes. Complete Streets is really supposed to be an all-inclusive, policy, plan, and implementation, right? It should inform the decisions that are made along the way to decide, how we select a facility, right? How that fits into our existing street design classifications, our functional classifications, right? So that it's a true reflection of the needs, and in most cases, the competition of space that we're going to encounter when we try to reallocate them to accommodate different modes. So all ages and abilities. This is, some people call them AAA streets or AAA networks, right? This is trying to ensure that the facilities that we're providing are safe and they're comfortable. They're of course accessible, but that they're going to be used, they're intended for use for the widest demographic of users, right? That includes people with disabilities, it includes young kids, it includes older adults, the full spectrum of users. And so how do we equate that to the types of facilities that we're designing, the types of facilities that we want to provide in different contexts? Well, so we have a couple of different methods. Who's familiar with level traffic stress, LTS? Maybe about half of you. So this is an evaluation and analysis that kind of cropped up maybe about 10, 15 years ago. And it allows us to assign a score to a streetscape context based on user comfort, and that's a translation of users' perception of safety. It's a translation of what we think different users are going to feel and experience along that streetscape in that particular facility, right? So it's a scale of 1 to 4, 1 being the best and 4 being the most stressful or the least comfortable, right? And this was developed for developing bike networks and evaluating bike networks in particular. This has since evolved to include pedestrians. So there's a whole pedestrian level of traffic stress analysis that we have now. And that's going to account for things like vehicle speeds, of course, vehicle volumes, number of lanes, but it's increasingly accounting for the conditions within that facility. So for pedestrians, the condition of the sidewalk, the width of the sidewalk, the presence or absence of a buffer, right? All of these elements, all of these design elements are going to contribute to how stressful or how comfortable that streetscape, that segment, that part of the network is. And so we run this analysis and it gives us a sense of like where the deficiencies are not only across the corridor, but across the larger network. LTS is, I'll just say it's a starting point, right? It allows us to identify where to start. So this is part of the implementation that Colin's talking about. And we can apply this to a variety of different kinds of projects, from new construction to street retrofits to spot improvements, right? Improving things like curb ramps or corner curb extensions, bulb outs, that sort of thing. We can apply this for long-term projects. We can apply this for short-term demonstration or pilot projects, right? And we can do this in a variety of ways that's going to tell us how well it's working, how well the users are responding to the level of stress or the level of comfort that they're experiencing in those facilities. So as designers, planners, we need to understand, the application of things like facility selection guidance, of design guidance, but we don't have to know all of the details. We don't have to know the nuts and bolts, right? That's the job of engineers, civil engineers. That's the job of traffic engineers, to understand, the details in the design. Fortunately, we have a lot of great resources at our fingertips, especially when it comes to active transportation over the last 10 years or so. There's a long list here of things that have just been updated or are about to be updated. Things like the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, Urban Bikeway Design Guide. The new AASHTO Bike Guide is going to be coming out in mid-December. And of course, PROAG, the Public Rights of Way Accessibility Guidelines, was just codified, right? So we have this guidance. We have this really great guidance at every level, federal, state, local, and it gives us a really good idea of how to meet the needs of a particular facility, of a particular streetscape, based on all of these different metrics. And so all of that's available at our fingertips. It's the application of that, the implementation of that we want to talk about today. Colin, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about the Alaska specific guidance there, but.
No, I think this is mainly more about the statewide complete streets policy. So kind of bring up how that might influence state design guides in the future.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so a lot of the design guidance traditionally for streetscape design is based on our street classifications, our functional classifications, right? And so we have our arterials, we have our collectors, and we have our local streets. And everyone's seen diagrams like this, right? What is the function of these different classifications to carry volumes of users, right? Typically, we're talking about people driving cars. How many cars is this roadway going to serve? What are the volumes it can accommodate? When is it at capacity? What does that mean in terms of our experience related to congestion or delay? But we can broaden that framework to think about the other modes using other criteria, right? We can still use this arterial collector local streets hierarchy, that framework, to define a context that is suitable for pedestrians or for cyclists or for people taking the bus, right? We can do it for freight too. And so this hierarchy still applies. We just want to broaden our thinking and application of it. So I think the next few slides here are just some quick screenshots of our design standards, design classifications for the arterials, collectors, and local streets. So you can see, these are pretty typical dimensions, pretty standard layout for each of these cross sections. Arterials, we've got trails, we've got sidewalks, generally 11 to 12-foot travel lanes, and we've got some nice medians in there. The cool thing that you don't see in every cross section standard drawing in other places is that buffer for snow storage, which is nice to see, right? It has a lot of benefits beyond snow storage. Same thing with the collector. You can look at the sidewalk widths. Those are always going to vary. Those are typically the more constrained kind of element of that streetscape. Sidewalks and pathways, the amount of separation we provide back of curb, and then the travel way itself from curb to curb. What are the lane widths? What are we looking at when it comes to turn lanes, turn pockets, center turn lanes, and shoulders, right? Those are typically the places where we're looking first to see what flexibility we have, see what room we have to work with, to start to enhance the quality and the design of the facilities that are serving other modes. And there's one for the local street as well. So who's heard of the term road diet? We've all heard the term road diet, right? It can be somewhat controversial, right? It's sort of limiting in it implies a more limited scope because we're taking something away, we're putting something on a diet, right? And so I think in terms of terminology, we've kind of moved away from road diet, the roadway reconfigurations, the reallocations. It's all the same concept. First, we're looking at the number of lanes. We're looking at opportunities to reallocate some of that space for other uses. We're looking at potentially narrowing some of those lanes, right? Wider lanes encourage faster speeds. So how can we right size them so that A, they have sort of that traffic calming effect, and B, we can use that space for something else, right? Every 6 inches matters when it comes to reallocating that space. Typically, when we're looking at a complete streets project, you know, we're thinking about the pedestrian experience, we're thinking about transit. But I think where everyone's kind of gravitates towards is are we adding a bike lane? And what does that mean, right? If we're adding a bikeway of some kind, how is that space going to serve that facility? More importantly, how is it going to serve the quality of the experience in that bike lane, right? We can gain 4 feet somewhere and stripe a bike lane. But what's the point of that if no one's going to use it because it's on a 40-mile-an-hour arterial, right? We want to be thinking about how that space can be used in a way that is actually going to contribute to the quality of the facility so that people actually use it, so that we see the use and the increase in ridership that we want. So oftentimes, every 6-inch we're fighting for is going to be applied to the width of a bikeway. It's going to be the buffer of the bikeway, right? It's going to serve as a little bit more separation between the folks that might be using something like that or a sidewalk and the moving vehicles. Traffic calming, here's another concept I'm sure all of you are familiar with. These are all the sorts of design elements that you might consider in your toolkit, right? Narrower lanes, speed humps, vertical deflection, horizontal deflection. All of these are in our kind of speed management toolbox, right? Things that are going to require people to slow down for. Typically, you find these on lower order streets, so your local streets, sometimes on collectors. They're ideal in application when it comes to bikeways and creating a more multimodal corridor. In Portland, we call them neighborhood greenways. In other places, they call them like boulevards. There are a handful of other names that we refer to these local streets as, but the idea is that they're slow streets and that they're streets that are going to prioritize pedestrian movement, local traffic, kids riding bikes, people walking dogs, right? Because we want those lower speeds and those more comfortable environments. The last thing on that list is what I would consider a volume control or volume management, diverters, right? And we've got a few of those around town as well, where we're altering the flow and the circulation patterns, the access for different users, right? Generally speaking, when we're talking about traffic calming and we're talking about completing a street or completing a network, when we're introducing diverters, it's to allow the permeability for pedestrians and cyclists while limiting the permeability or the access for people driving, right? In a neighborhood, that can sometimes be pretty contentious, pretty controversial at first. But when you think about all the benefits versus the cost of implementing something like that, you quickly realize that residents that are leaving their house twice a day stand much less to lose than the gains that everyone else in that neighborhood has, right? The circulation, the access that people have, and the calmer environment that provides. Okay, so I'm gonna go through some pedestrian facilities and some bike facilities. I really want to just kind of focus on the things that you're most interested in that maybe you don't see as much of around town. I know you've got great sidewalks. I know you've got less than great sidewalks, paths, side paths, shared use paths. But I also want to talk about things like enhanced crossings, not only marked crossings, but the kind of enhancements you can add, rectangular rapid flashing beacons or hawk beacons. You can introduce medians or curb extensions, right? And you can do those all in a way that is not going to constrain things like stormwater drainage. You can do them in ways that allow for more buffer space for snow storage. And then who here is familiar with protected intersections? The concept of protected. Okay, great. And so usually you see that in of the cycling environment, right? You've got a separated bike lane or protected bike lane. What happens at the intersection? You want to design the intersection in a way that's going to reduce the conflicts, make for a more comfortable environment. And that's going to impact all the different modes, right? All of these things require space. And unless we're building a brand new subdivision, we've got to figure out how we want to prioritize the space that we have toward things like this. Okay, so bikeways. My understanding is that we don't have a ton of separated bike lanes in town. We maybe piloted one downtown. Yeah, okay. This is a relatively new thing, in the States anyway, right? We started to see these maybe about 15 years ago, in more rapid sort of implementation. City of Davis in California had been doing them in the 70s, so there are traces of this here in the States, but it's been a fairly recent development in most, urban contexts. Protected bike lanes, separated bike lanes. These are bikeways that have not only a buffer, a physical separation between other modes, but some kind of vertical element, a barrier of some kind, or these are, of course, going to range in their degree of protection, but something to separate, to delineate, more than delineate, but physically separate different users. So that's just a couple examples there of some separated bike lanes. Generally, the practice has moved toward physical separation as the higher and better sort of facility type, right? The more separation you can have, the less likely that there's going to be conflicts. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but it has to be done in the right way. There's a lot of design details here that could quickly make these types of situations more dangerous, more uncomfortable, right? So you have to be really thoughtful about how we're doing them. Simply laying down a two-way protected bike lane in an urban context can come with a lot of challenges, right? Same thing is true of shared use paths. When we're mixing users, when we're introducing different users operating at different speeds, going in different directions, in constrained environments, things can get pretty tricky pretty quickly. So we want to be really thoughtful about how we're not only designing these facilities, but designing the networks and designing the corridors that are going to allow for really great, safe, comfortable transitions. Okay, so this is kind of the list of bikeway types that you might see.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think in Anchorage, the challenge that we have, particularly with physical separation, is the
difficulty in maintaining it in the winter.
Yes.
If it's, you know, if it's part of the road and it can be plowed as part of the road and doesn't become the snow storage, then that makes it a lot easier to be maintained.
Yeah.
But that reliability in the winter is a big challenge for.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll touch on maintenance here in a second, because I know that is really important, especially in, you know, the more northern climates where we have snow, where we have snow events, where it's on the ground for longer periods of time, right? And you're right, that is usually the biggest challenge for cities implementing protected bike lanes of any kind when we've got snow. So that's kind of the spectrum. We generally assign those types of facilities to that same LTS score, right? So the more separation, the better. But sometimes a shared street or a bike boulevard where it's low volumes, low speeds, you've got traffic calming, can also be really comfortable. So you want to always think about not only just the score, the LTS score, and how much space you have, but what it's going to mean in terms of the context. Is it in a neighborhood? Is it in an urban environment? Is it more rural? Is it along a highway? These are all going to contribute to the kind of facility that's going to be most appropriate. And again, you see protected intersections, you see the green paint, right? That is something that was just recently kind of standardized in the latest version of the MUTCD. So things like green paint or red paint, these are things that you're starting to see in a lot more places, and it's now finally codified. So it's in our toolkit, so to speak. Was there a hand? No. Yeah. Same thing's true of transit, right? Not only the transit operations and how well the transit system's functioning, but all of the different elements that contribute to a good transit experience. So that's the bus stop designs, the stop amenities, what it's like waiting for the bus, right? In addition to all of the sorts of service improvements that we can make to the operations of the transit line itself, the transit vehicle itself. So dedicated bus lanes or BAT lanes, as we call them, things like transit signal priority that are going to give, you know, the extra green time for transit vehicles, queue jumps, and then again, thinking about from the user experience perspective, like what it means for someone to walk out their door, walk to a bus stop, wait, get on a bus, and then, you know, do the same thing on the opposite end. Thinking about locations, thinking about frequencies is all really, really important. More recently, we've sort of come across the need to kind of understand the interactions between bus riders and cyclists as we see more of these separated bike lanes being built. You know, what does that mean when they're along a transit line and you've got a bus stop or a shelter? How do you manage those interactions in a way that's going to reduce conflicts for people cycling, people stepping off the bus, and pedestrians running to catch the bus, right? And then, as Colin was pointing out earlier, thinking about not only the facilities along the corridor, but how we cross the corridor, and really providing the opportunities for people to do that safely and comfortably, right? So thinking about the distance between crossings. The second bullet point there is a reference to policies that can establish how frequently those crossings need to be, depending on the variety of different contexts you come across. In a more urban environment, people are going to be looking to cross the street more often, right? And so you want to provide those crossing opportunities so that we can try to prevent people running out, you know, making a calculated decision to cross the street, even if it isn't in a crosswalk. And by that token, higher compliance rates, right? More predictability in the operations across the streetscape. A lot of these crossing improvements can of course be at intersections, but they can also be at mid-block, and you can introduce a lot of other enhanced crossing treatments to improve that activity where we think it's needed. Okay. So this is an example from Portland of the crossing spacing standard. Depending on the context, we have what we call pedestrian districts. Those are part of the pedestrian modal network. You have to have a crossing every 530 feet, no less. Or I'm sorry, no more. You can have more of them, but you have to have one at least every 530 feet, because that is essentially the length of 2 blocks. Right. Further from the core, in areas that are not pedestrian districts, not adjacent to transit, parks or schools, that spacing can be a little bit further out. You can space them at slightly greater intervals because there's not as much activity, right? And the destinations are fewer and further between. So this is just an idea of a policy that can establish actual design and how you're planning for that kind of activity across the network. How are we doing on time? 4:03. Okay. We're probably going to want to jump through here, but go ahead. Yeah.
Is that Oregon is that just like rule of thumb or guidance, or is that like documented somewhere?
It's documented. That's from a table in their blueprint for urban design, which is their design guidance for a variety of different highway facility contexts. Yeah. It's a really good document from a policy standpoint. Okay. We talked a little bit about intersection operations, designing the corners, designing them for the different types of activity we anticipate, not only crossings, but turning movements, interactions with bikes, bus stops, right? These are all the little design details that are going to either contribute to the safe and comfortable environments we want to see, or they're going to detract from it. They're going to diminish them. So these are just some of the examples of different treatments at the corner that we might consider, in addition to the protected intersections that I was mentioning earlier. So that's all of the sort of geometric design treatments that we think about. There's also signal timing and operational improvements that we can make to buy folks more time, buy folks more separation in time. So things like leading pedestrian intervals, leading bike intervals, things like bike signals, right? Turn restrictions, resting in red, transit signal priority. These are all examples of ways we can optimize the signal timing, the movement and the flow of traffic to prioritize these other modes. And in thinking about that experience from the beginning of a trip to the end of a trip, what do people need at their destination? What are the types of things that are going to encourage them to make the trip in the first place, right? How can we make it easier and not more burdensome for folks that are arriving by bike or by transit? Providing bike parking, easy one. But there are lots of ways to get that wrong and reasons why people don't use it, right? Park and rides. These are other traditional means of providing the capacity for people that are arriving by a certain mode. Mobility hubs is who's heard of a mobility hub, right? I think this is pretty common terminology these days, but it's the convergence of all of those different modes, right? And increasingly, it can be about not just about the transportation needs and the end of trip facilities for folks that are arriving by different modes, but the kinds of development potential that we might have as a part of that. So, thinking about community centers and resiliency hubs and places where people are going to naturally attract to and providing all of the services that they're going to need. Okay, last slide. Maintenance. So this is general maintenance, but also winter maintenance. Having a complete street policy, a good one, is going to involve policies around maintenance. It's going to involve policies around prioritizing maintenance, right? For the different kinds of facilities that we see. So not just how often and when and what roads we're plowing in the winter, but what about the bikeways? What about the sidewalks? What about the paths? What about the bus stops, right? Thinking about it more holistically from a complete streets and a complete system perspective, we want to know that policy is going to provide for the not just the adequate maintenance of those facilities, but think about those rare storm occasions where snow's on the ground, you've got piles of it. How frequently do we need to be maintaining that? And what are the ways that we can equip our public works staff to deal with it in a way that is going to be cost effective, right? Budgeting for maintenance, big deal, right? We can incorporate that into our policies so that we're not just thinking about the capital costs of something and finding out year after year after year, snowstorm, after snowstorm, that our fleets are inadequate, that we don't have the right tools for the right jobs, right? So winter maintenance is a big deal. General maintenance, of course, is a big deal, sweeping, right? But how do we deal with the needs of the folks that are maintaining our roads in the long term is also really important and a part of that complete streets policy. I think that's all I want to say about that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add would be that through the non-motorized plan, Anchorage does have a winter maintenance strategy. So some of these things are incorporated and have been thought about in existing planning documents, and so one place to start.
Yeah. Is there a question? Yes.
The non-motorized plan does incorporate that maintenance policy component. Have you all in your work seen that inclusion encourage any changes in maintenance and adopted?
I think a big portion of that falls on state roads. But you can have a significant role in limiting its usefulness for us. State was severely strapped in their ability to push them.
Yeah.
I will just say, the current administration, city has taken a big effort. I think general and I think this year it's maybe more articulating what we've done in the past and are communicating about it, but I think going forward, they're looking at how do we need to change.
Yeah, and I think we're kind of doing a little bit more planning for it in like a cross section, things like that. You actually showing see snow storage as like planned for, as opposed to just to resolve. It just ends up where it is. So, even for the public outreach, we kind of see there is a similar level and that's at least.
Yeah. Okay, well, should we pivot to the exercise?
Yeah,
The time
let's do it.
Okay. Okay, so as you walked in, you walked past the table with all of those little game pieces. We're going to ask you to turn to your neighbors, get into groups of about 5 or so. Then we're going to distribute some materials here. Basically, this is a streetscape design exercise. We're going to ask you to design a streetscape based on a road that should be somewhat familiar, or a context that should be somewhat familiar. And we want to see what y'all come up with, right? The goal is, of course, to make it as multimodal as possible. But as you're getting started, we're going to come around and we're going to assign some roles. We're going to ask you to put on a different cap, and we want you to advocate for the kinds of things that you think would be needed from that perspective. And then at the end, we're going to reserve a little bit of time for you to come back and we'll compare what y'all came up with. So yeah, maybe start assembling into groups of about five or so.